Let's shift our focus into that first part of the lecture. We'll start off by talking about a general framework for thinking about causal theories, a framework in which we explicitly and ineliminably make reference or utilize causal concepts in order to differentiate knowledge from less praiseworthy epistemic states. We'll then talk about how the traditional causal theories represent one of many possible strategies for doing just that. We'll notice that there aren't any pure instances of the traditional causal theory, in part because it doesn't seem to be capable of handling all the various cases that we might want to look at if we have a definitional theory like a justified true belief theory within that causal framework. So we'll talk about the ways in which theorists tinker in order to try and get all the cases right. We'll talk about how they introduce non-causal properties as part of the description of the causal connections that they propose between a fact out in the world and the belief about that fact. We'll talk about how they also will delimit the scope of their theory to some subset of the overall set of knowledge. So in the case of Goldman, we have a delimiting of knowledge to empirical knowledge. With Dredske, we have day-ray perceptual knowledge, and so on. So this is my approach, but I'm going to have Alvin play narrator. In formulating a theory of knowledge, one provides a general framework with which one can delimit a subset of a cognizer's states and or dispositions, a means by which to differentiate mental states in general from those mental states having high epistemic warrant. And one way to think about that is an effective decision procedure. A procedure that if you follow it, it will always get you the right answer, and it will sort every mental state that a cognizer might have, every disposition that they might have, into epistemically praiseworthy and epistemically blameworthy. So using that idea of a definitional theory of knowledge, it provides us with a basis to differentiate a system's epistemically praiseworthy mental states or dispositions from other states. Then one can delineate the causal strategy for defining knowledge as follows. The causal strategy for defining knowledge requires that causal concepts play an explicit and ineliminable role in differentiating knowledge states from other states. Now you might say, well, how is that supposed to work? Well, you can specify different kinds of causality, and as long as you're specifying them in causal terminology, then you've got a causal theory there. You can't get rid of those causal terms without eviscerating your theory. In other words, a theory of knowledge counts as an instance of the causal strategy only if one cannot explicate knowledge within the theory without making reference to causal concepts. And one way to think about that is try to think about how you would specify a recipe for chocolate chip cookies without making any reference at all to chocolate chips. It seems like it can't really do that. And that's the idea behind the causal strategy. The strategy says, look, I want to use, or I need to use, these causal concepts in order to formulate my definitional theory of knowledge. And if I can't use those causal concepts, it can't function as a definition of knowledge should. So I'll use the term causal theory to denote a theory that's an instance of this overarching causal strategy for defining knowledge. I'll use the term traditional causal theory to refer to those instances of the causal strategy that have actually been forwarded and defended as causal theories in the Western philosophical tradition. Interestingly enough, all of the theories that I'm aware of in the Western philosophical tradition have the same general connection between the world and the belief facilitated by causal connection. And how does that causal connection work? Well, we have some cognizer here, and we have some object, call it R. And that object has some property. So together, the object and the property, they specify some fact about the world. Now that fact about the world causes our cognizer to form their belief, the belief that says, hey, that individual has that property. So the fact causes the belief about the fact. And that's the general formula for all the traditional causal theories out there. Now, once I've shown you the traditional causal theory schema, you might say, yeah, now that I look at that, I don't think there are any other kinds of causal theories out there. That whole beginning of the lecture really was pointless and empty. Now, that may be true, but what is definitely true is that it's not the case that there aren't alternatives. We can specify a causal source, for instance, a theory that says the only beliefs that count as knowledge are beliefs that are caused by, say, God. We can specify a process causal story. The only beliefs that count as knowledge are the ones that are caused by process A, process B, or process C. We could specify a reliable correlation story. The only things that count as knowledge are things that are caused by things that are reliably correlated with the state of affairs, and so on. So you have to be a little bit more creative to come up with alternatives, because this is the most obvious thing. The fact I want to believe is in fact what causes my belief, but there are plenty of alternative versions of the causal strategy out there, if you just think about it for a moment. Framing traditional causal theories within a larger causal strategy accomplishes two things in my mind. One, it focuses us on the idea that this is supposed to really make a difference. The appeal to causal concepts is supposed to be important somehow. And two, if it really is the case that causal concepts are important in our theory of knowledge, what did they do, and why is it that we don't see any other permutations of this general strategy out there? Now you might say, hey, I know the answer to that one, Wallace. It's because the traditional causal theory is so darn good. Well, I'm pretty skeptical of that. I mean, consider the following case. Remember, not every causal chain that ends in a belief is going to end in knowledge. So suppose that Donald, whom I know to be a chronic liar, sees my car lights on and informs me of the fact, uncharacteristically. Based solely upon his report, I come to believe that my lights are on. There's a causal chain from my lights being on to my belief that my lights are on. Yet my belief doesn't seem to count as knowledge, since I know that Donald lies a lot. For a causal theory to correctly diagnose troublesome cases like this one, theoreticians must tinker with the basic causal story. Generally, they'll add various clauses to their definitions in order to exclude intuitively unsatisfactory causal chains and to include intuitively satisfactory causal chains. Such additional clauses require that causal connections linking the object to the belief have additional properties. These clauses and the properties that they require distinguish one causal theory from another. And so we'll get versions of our causal theory post-tinkering that have this general form. Again, we've got our cognizer, we've got our object with that property P, and that object with the property P causes our cognizer to form that belief, hey, that chap is an alien. Now, however, we've got those additional properties, X, Y, and Z, that specify additional constraints on the kinds of causal theories that are going to result in knowledge. I'm going to suggest that causal clauses usually introduce non-causal properties. So there's no explicit reason why they have to do that. They just do seem to do that. For instance, Goldman's 1967 theory requires a warranted inferential claim in cases of inferential knowledge, i.e., a chain based upon true premises that confirm the resultant belief either deductively or inductively. Adding non-causal clauses doesn't disallow theories as causal theories of knowledge. However, the causal theorist must make sure that the addition of that non-causal clause doesn't render the causal clause empty or redundant, and we'll want to keep our eye on that particular point as we move through the lecture. So just as philosophers traditionally introduce supplementary non-causal clauses to handle problem cases, many also deal with problem cases by limiting the scope of their theories. For example, Goldman's 1967 theory isn't a theory of knowledge, it's a causal theory of knowledge of empirical facts. Dresky proposes a causal theory of de re perceptual knowledge, not the entire scope of the knowledge circle, just a subset therein. And that'll be important as well. So when we think about that post-tinkering causal theory with limited scope, we get a much different sort of picture about how powerful and robust the addition of these causal clauses is actually going to be. And we'll pick that up when we turn our attention to Goldman's theory in the next lecture module.